Thank you very much, Anna. And for those who are attending, I appreciate your being with us. And hopefully in this particular keynote discussion, we'll have something that will stimulate your thoughts and contributions in terms of some questions at the end. I do wish to sort of state that there is a sort of perspective bias here in that what I will primarily be doing is giving a review of the nutraceutical dietary supplement industry from a USA American perspective. So for those of you, it's a very international audience. If you have differences, please understand that this is the perspective from the US, and it would be worthwhile discussing different countries and their perspectives. So the way I've sort of arranged the discussion today is to think of it in terms of three angles, and that is threats, opportunities, and intangibles. So it's a way of fleshing out some elements of the industry. And one of the things that I always like to discuss is understand who is the end user, who is the consumer, what are their needs, what are their characteristics, so we can better appreciate and understand the end consumer. And so I've broken that down into a series of questions, and that is who, what, where, and why. And as it relates to, and again, this is USA data, the who is primarily women, although not extraordinarily so in terms of use. Marketing data tends to say that women tend to buy it, but they would also buy it for their male companions. So it's in the US it's quite high. 65% of the population takes supplements. So this is the majority. The other aspect that's kind of interesting is that as you get older, and this is perhaps underappreciated, in fact the screen cuts off a little bit, so 18 to 34 is about 65%, and as you get older and more systems perhaps are not working, you tend to increase your use of supplements. The other element is that they tend to be consumed by people who have some education. 72% of people taking supplements are actually college graduates. So this is reflective that education is part of the process of making the choice to take supplements. And the other element is that surveys have shown that 90% actually read the labels. So be careful what is on the label. So that's a little bit about who. Another element related to the demographics is in terms of why. This is a rank order of the number of characteristics of the supplements that are being taken, primarily vitamins and minerals. There's 97% of those who take supplements take an MVM, a multivitamin mineral. There are next some specialty supplements, and then followed by herbal botanicals, which is around 26%, and then sports nutrition, weight management is the next biggest category, around 19%. And where consumers go to buy these particular supplements in the US, it's primarily in mass merchandisers, 41%, followed by drugstores and supermarkets, and then warehouse clubs. It's primarily things like Sam's or Costco, very big organizations. Then lastly, specialty retailers, which are around 12%, and then online retailers, which are around 12%. This is the demographics that's probably 2 or 3 years old. I would suggest to you that it's the online retailers that are changing very, very quickly. And the nature of online sales also has some impact on decision making. So for example, a lot of consumers gravitate to products that have been reviewed by other consumers, just as they would for other consumable products. And so that's having a bigger influence on decision making as it relates to purchasing. Now, as it comes down to why are they actually taking these particular supplements, the number one reason is overall health and wellness. That's around 54%, followed by filling nutritional gaps. So these are perceived gaps, either through the nature of the diet. And then there's a relatively strong middle pack, which get down to specialty requests, whether it be bone health, immune health, heart health, aging, wanting energy. And then a little bit below that is joint health, and lastly is actually prevention, although that has some similarities to overall health and wellness. The other aspect is that supplement users are generally those who are actually participating in an active, healthy lifestyle. And you may easily make the request that the individuals who need supplements the most are the ones who are not actually taking the supplements. That is, the ones who have lack of exercise, very poor diets, clear nutritional gaps, and by contrast, the ones who do have a healthy lifestyle are looking to augment and optimize that particular lifestyle. Now, getting back to my original mission of looking at threats for the industry, this is one of the particular threats, or a class of threat, that is particularly a driver for change, at least here in the US, and that is product adulteration. And there's several types of adulteration. For example, there is economic adulteration, and these are some of the drivers. Economic adulteration is when a product isn't what it should be on the label or what it states it is. It's been diluted out, or there is some economic reduction in the quality of the components. So usually it's price driven. It can be, depending on where you actually purchase the supplement, be more or less common. And it certainly has some pressures where there is low margins, low commercial margins, such as in certain mass retail outlets and the ones that have discounts. So it comes down to often what you would consider as you get what you purchase. If it's a very cheap product, you may end up having a cheap set of ingredients based on those economic adulterations. And the other thing related to that is that it's often associated with single ingredients as opposed to some more complex formulas. The other aspect that's interesting is that there is also adulteration of the raw materials. In some circumstances, this is benign by the end manufacturer and really a component of the ingredient or the supply chain aspects. So, for example, pomegranate, in natural examples, you cannot get more than 45% allergic acid. But when you see a supply chain of pomegranate extract that has whatever, 80%, 90% of allergic acid, you know that there is some degree of adulteration, maybe for positive reasons. More likely what it is economic gain. So it's not a pure pomegranate extract in that particular sense. There are some other adulterations as it relates to management in the supply chain, misuse of tests in order to get a higher number to make it impressive, improper or inaccurate certificates of analysis. And the other aspect that occurs in the raw material supply chain that is particularly of concern is in the botanical area. Botanicals have a problem as it relates to making sure that your botanical is the botanical that is on the certificate of analysis, the one that you're trying to create. There are replacement plants, and when you have a situation where the botanical is converted, say, into a final powder and it's lost its trail, then it's more difficult to understand if the botanical has been adulterated or not. It's just more difficult. The other aspect, as an example, is the protein, amino acid, melamine story that largely came out of China, particularly as it relates to the infant formula market, where there was an adulteration to achieve higher test results for protein content in infant formulas. And this was done through the use of melamine, which gave a positive result in the test, but it's not actually a source of amino acids or protein. Related to that, in the USA, the FDA has made a rule that if you're putting down in your ingredient labels, you cannot use amino acids to reflect the amount of protein that's in a particular product. So if you, for example, you have 10 grams of protein and 3 grams of amino acids, by the FDA laws here in the USA, the amino acids don't count, so the total is still only 10 grams, even though amino acids are obviously constituents of proteins. So there are sort of constraints related to tricks of the trade as it relates to adulterating products. And the other aspect related to adulteration is deliberate adulteration, and this is in reflection to some of the markets in particular. Weight loss, sports management are the key ones, and in sports management it's often related to things like anabolic steroids, which often get athletes into trouble. Very recently here in the US, last year, there was enactment of a new law called DASCA, the Dietary Anabolic Steroid Control Act. And basically what that particular law did was, in terms of testing for these false anabolic steroids, it took the dietary supplements out of the regulations of the FDA and the FTC and put it into the regulations of the DEA, which is the Drug Enforcement Agency. And so there was an entirely different and far more powerful agency in terms of regulating the particular products. So if you were a company and you were making a product that had an anabolic steroid that was on the list from DASCA, you would be rated not by the FDA with pieces of paper and a checklist for good manufacturing practices. You'd actually be rated by the Drug Enforcement Agency, and they carry guns. So different groups, highly effective. So in summary, there is sort of 4 different types of characteristics of product adulteration, and some of these elements of the motivation behind these adulteration mechanisms, at least in the US, reflects either low barriers of entry into the market. They do it because they can, and they do it until they're caught. Some are due to economic predation on the consumer, or trying to make increased profits in the world of low costs and small margins. Others prey on vulnerable consumers. I would say that the sports management and weight loss areas have as characteristic consumers that are always looking for the latest, greatest thing and are therefore vulnerable to predators. And then the other is inadequate testing procedures inbuilt to address the current laws. So out of those, the top one and the last one could be solved by enacting or enforcing, rather, the current laws that are on the books here in the USA, as well as potentially increasing regulations. Whereas the economic predation and the vulnerable markets is more of a societal issue and more difficult to resolve. So the other perspective in terms of threats to the industry is regulatory pressures. And just because this is a very international group, just a reminder that these regulations vary from country to country. Australia perhaps has the most difficult dietary supplement regulatory laws. They're very much like a pharmaceutical approach. Europe has its own set of perspectives. They're very conservative as it relates to claims that you can make. Canada has an interesting balanced approach, I would say. In they require the generation of a natural products number prior to entry into the market. So before you can enter the market, you have to deliver certain degrees of information about the product, about safety, about efficacy, but associated with that, you can actually get some claims that are more pharmaceutical-like in terms of disease prevention. In the US, you cannot make disease claims. The law that was passed here was passed in 1994. It was called DSHEA, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, and it just sort of squeaked through. It has some flaws, and slowly in the US they're trying to either address them, modify it, improve it, but it is certainly open to a lot of factions. Certain interpretations come through. The new dietary ingredients is currently a guidelines with the FDA, and they try and give you an idea of if you have a new ingredient, if you're a manufacturer, what you can actually classify and whether the amount of information that is required for you to enter the particular market. Some may enter without any restraints, and some may require a lot of documentation according to the NDI. Also, because of the aversion in the US with disease claims, it's actually had a significant impact on the conducting of clinical trials to support a product here in the US. There are some that CROs and universities are rather restrictive in terms of doing clinical work because it will mandate that previous comment of a new dietary ingredient. So if you're a company that has a modification of a botanical or some other combination, and you're wanting to enter the market and you want clinical trials in order to support your product and put it in the right perspective, it may be very difficult to do those studies in the US because it may require a new dietary ingredient, and that is a lot more paperwork. So the end result of that is that a lot of the clinical trials that support product innovation in the US is done in other countries. And so that is an issue as it relates to the US. The other thing that is of a driver in the US is they're certainly trying to manage and update the law DSHEA. And in addition, you have to manage different state legislations. The states in the US are quite powerful, and some of them enact interesting and rather restrictive laws. And in particular, California stands out as being the one that comes up with the most constraining laws. And I've mentioned on this particular slide Prop 65, which is not just for dietary ingredients, but in fact a whole range of different factors, environmental factors that would regulate and be impactful. So that has a lot of impact. The most challenging aspect probably with Prop 65 as it relates to the US and California is the amount of metals that are in plant-based products. And so there's always a constraint that there's natural forms of lead and other metals in any plant-based product because they're extracting it out of the soil and can exceed the levels that California finds tolerable. So it's a big constraint. The other thing is in the US is that we have an extraordinarily large number of lawyers and they need to keep busy. So as a result of that, there is a lot of class action lawsuits, and in particular coming from California. So I don't know if anyone's from California here in the audience. I think there's some Amway people, they live there, but they have to deal with it as well, even though they're a global company. So what happens is that there is a lot of legal actions, rightly or wrongly, that have an impact on doing business here in the US. So this is a summary of some of the things that are drivers for innovation and cost to enter the market. But in general, the US is still one of the easiest countries to enter, even though it's and quite large. So it's usually the first port of entry for innovations in the dietary supplement industry. Another threat is media coverage. I would say in the last decade or so, we've had a change in orientation with the media, with a great deal of emphasis on fear selling. So there is more and more coverage on dietary ingredients, supplements, other aspects as it relates to promoting fear in the consumers. And this gets very, very confusing. Positive news doesn't quite sell as well, and therefore is not discussed with the same degree of propensity or emphasis. The other aspect that's rather interesting is that academic input, and I assume the academic affiliates who are here today are not part of this, but generally in academia, the view of dietary supplements is very negative. So it's very easy for the media to wheel out a particular academic, some expert, who would take a role in supporting that particular media coverage in a negative tone. And I say that from personal experience. Prior to moving to Healthy Directions, I did 30 years as a medical school professor. So I've often seen academics not get trained in terms of nutrition or dietary supplements, and also to show a rather negative tone as to their particular role in managing health. So one of the things that we could do in society is put a greater emphasis on medical student education in terms of disease prevention, and including diet and dietary supplements. That's all very challenging, and in general, this makes it confusing to consumers. So the consumers are generally in a state of, where do I go for particular advice? And the other aspect about the way that we manage health, particularly in the USA, and it's very similar, I would imagine, to the Western world, is that we currently have the face of medicine that's orientated towards disease management as opposed to disease prevention. And as a result, the way that the healthcare community interacts with consumers is a little discordant as it relates to our particular role and potential contributions. In addition, there is a general lack of acceptance, trust, usage of traditional medicines from other cultures. Generally, I think it's a societal or human behavior in that what is familiar to you is comfortable. What is unfamiliar with you is uncomfortable. And so we often struggle to incorporate health approaches from one culture to another culture. And that is something that I think the language of science can actually improve. So what's happened now in Western societies is that we've got a diverse group of people that we may seek a health advice from. It used to be almost solely your physician. That has somewhat changed now. In the US, we have chiropractors who have moved into a space that is largely dealing with functional foods, dietary supplements, which to my mind is an intriguing development, because the practice of chiropractic is more about bones and alignment and neural aspects, but they are definitely big players and drivers now in terms of nutrition and diet. Dietitians, I think, can do more in terms of improving their scientific knowledge base and understanding trends as relates to mechanisms of action. They're actually still giving a fairly conservative party line. And then often what's happening now with social media is that a lot of advice actually comes from either your friends or anonymous people online giving 4 or 5 stars for a particular product. And so that is a changing face of how we make or collect information about our health choices. The other aspect that I wanted to discuss was more legal aspects as it relates to terms and labels. This is particularly good fodder for lawyers, lawsuits. What you can see is that the all-natural lexicon is basically going to be totally disappearing from the US market. If you have a product that you label all natural and there's any component that the legal system views as not being natural, then you'll lose a court case. And there's been tons and tons of examples of people settling legal cases and removing that term. Same in Made in America, or whatever the country of origin here. If you have any component that is not local, then you are open to a lawsuit as it relates to Made in America or a ruling from the Federal Trade Commission. So, for example, if you have an omega-3 product and your fish don't come from American waters, it's not made in America. Or if you have an excipient, magnesium stearate, and you got that from China, it's not made in America. So this is where the lawyers will get you. There is a trend as it relates to consumers or their demands. They want to see things more sustainable. They want things to be more responsible. They want the industry to meet their societal needs. And as a relation to that, there is an increase in the number of certification programs that are popping up that give this information, this assurance to consumers that their product has some degree of oversight by a third party. And I've given just a few examples here. We have the Friends of the Sea aspect for omega-3 fatty acids as it relates to GOAD, for the commission related to omega-3 fatty acids. We got the NSF, informed choice, relations to banned substances for sports products. The USP is another product certification testing program, and certified sustainable seafood is another aspect that's meeting the needs the consumer demands. And this is just a small selection. There's a whole range. And often companies will invent their own logos to describe their own programs as it relates to the issues of sustainability, clear labels, and aspects like that. The question that we should all be asking in the industry is, who certifies the certifiers? You know, if we're using them for third-party certification, how do you know that they're doing a good job? And we're not at a stage to get answers for that as yet. So it's an intriguing component. Now, moving on to opportunities, economics and education, and one of the elements that I often like to describe the opportunity involves a report that was put out by the Council for Responsible Nutrition a couple of years ago called the Frost and Sullivan Report. And just to lay the foundation for this, the economics of how we use these preventative approaches to maintaining health, at least in the US, has a discord in that we have 75% of the total healthcare expenditures are actually on diseases that can be prevented. But we're treating them at a stage where it's not prevention, it's actual treatment, therapeutic. But we only spend 3% of the healthcare dollars on the prevention aspect. So there's a total mismatch in the way that we spend our money and allocate our resources. We're not doing it on prevention as it relates to diseases that are clearly preventable. And so one of the aspects that dietary supplements in the nutraceutical industry can play a big role in is use in the discussion the economic gains that are available and should be taken by using a dietary supplement, functional food, nutraceutical approach. And so the Frost and Sullivan report did that. They came out in 2012 and they predicted the healthcare savings largely on hospital costs, because these are hard metrics, easy to ascertain the numbers for a variety of different conditions, selected number of components in terms of nutraceuticals. And they projected this from either 2013 out to 2020 and came up with these particular numbers. So, for example, if you're greater than 55 years of age and if everyone in society, again, this is US, and I apologize for the US-only data here, but this is the nature of the report. So if everyone over the age of 55 used omega-3 fatty acids from 2013 out to 2020, there would be a saving in healthcare costs of $4 billion based on hospital costs, particularly as it relates to coronary heart disease. Similarly, B vitamins would reduce the number of coronary heart disease events by 808,000. Sticking with the same disease entity, phytosterols would save $4.23 billion every year in the US if every consumer was using them. Psyllium, as a dietary fiber, would also reduce by its cholesterol trapping actions, healthcare number of events by nearly 650,000. And then switching over to other disease entities, this is the ARID study, this is the eye health study. If you use lutein and zeaxanthin, if every member of the population over that particular age used zeaxanthin and lutein, we would save nearly $4 billion a year. Calcium, vitamin D for bone health would save $12 billion in healthcare costs. And magnesium would also throw in another $6.8 billion as it relates to hospitalization related to osteoporosis. So these economic numbers are very tight because they're just based on certain well-defined metrics as it relates to hospitalization costs, nothing to do with quality of life. So these are tools that I think the nutraceutical industry could better use as it relates to establishing why we are in existence. The other thing is that we need to improve our media conversation. We're kind of losing the conversation in terms of tone at the moment. There is that sort of fear-mongering negative discussion as it relates to the media. And we need to do a better job at talking about the opportunity that functional foods and dietary supplements offers. And we need to be drawing our comparisons to food sources as it relates to drugs. We tend to like to talk about disease, drugs, and use dietary supplements in the same language. And there is elements of truth in that, but we need to be much more orientated as it relates to food sources and building trust. And so related to that, the comments about improving our labeling, clean labels, avoiding the adulteration aspects, all those aspects that relate to consumer trust need to be built up. We need to regain and optimize and emphasize consumer confidence that what they're taking is actually what they expected is healthy. So to do that, I think we also need to deliver huge amounts of data, at least for it to be digested and understood. And clinical support is one of the aspects that's relating to putting functional foods and supplements in the right perspective. And always talk about what they are and not what they are not. So in terms of opportunities, this is one example. In terms of supply chain control and gaining consumer confidence, is to have great transparency. And this is a very interesting trend in the industry. I've got a picture of a boat here. This is actually a ship based out of Bergen, Norway, that my company uses to track its omega-3 fatty acids from codfish. And consumers can go online and actually follow the ship. It's their ship. We don't own it, but that's the one that we do. And so they know the name of the captain, and they feel great confidence that, the captain is going to give them their fish. So it's all part of that inclusion, transparency aspect. I think the transformation from the Made in USA, which has errors, obviously the fish are coming from Scandinavia here, that, you know, emphasize the positive aspects of global sourcing rather than necessarily the manufacturing and made in the USA. There's so many great resources around the world that you can tell stories and build consumer confidence. And you can build really wonderful conversations as it relates to the aspects of global sourcing and using the skills, knowledge, traditions of multiple cultures. There is also conversations out there that are involved that have sort of misinformation as it relates to things like, should the products be GMO, do they have soy, gluten, magnesium stearate as an excipient? All of these things are very confusing for consumers, and while there is a need to address their particular needs, some of their needs are misplaced and really not really helping to drive health. So the other aspects, to get into some specifics, some areas that I find are going to be big areas, is the microbiome. I mention this because it's an explosion of information at the moment relates to the bacterial community that defines us. And the pharmaceutical industry is not really well equipped to discuss this, tap into it, and use it for health purposes. So just to put you in perspective, for those who are not familiar with the microbiome, there are certain things that you need to consider in terms of health management. And that is that for our mammalian cells that constitute us as individuals, we're actually outnumbered 10 to 1 by microbes. There are different ones in different places. For instance, the bacterial profile that's on your right elbow is different from your left elbow, because if you're right or left-handed, there is a dominance of leaning on something or touching with your dominant arm. And so that microbial community is different between elbows. And throughout the GI tract, there's variances. Different bugs like to live in different places. But what we need to do as a community is contribute, mainly because we're the main community for delivering probiotics to consumers, is work with healthcare providers to get over what was the legacies of Louis Pasteur and germ theory, into discussing that our microbial community is really one of the aspects that is very, very powerful and quite positive. And we need to change our way of thinking about health. Our health is not just related to our mammalian cells, but it's actually the health of all of our community, that is both our mammalian cells and our microbes. And we need to take care of them, we need to nurture them, and we need to make sure that they're doing their job. This is a total change of understanding the drivers for health and disease. And it's going to be a big issue for consumers to get there. So we need to spend a lot of time spending education as to what is the value of the microbiome. So related to that, we need to do education about the misuse of antibiotics, the use of antibiotics in our food supply, and emphasize the concepts that the adage of you are what you eat is true, because what you eat determines which bacteria live in you and on you. So you are an evolving and changing person, and food changes who you are and what you are, and that dictates health. The other aspect that I find particularly fascinating is the role of probiotics in delivering the chemicals that are involved in changing gene expression as it relates to the epigenome. And so these are characteristics that are also inheritable. So the adage of you are what you eat is also applicable to you are what your parents ate, because that changes the way that you use your genes in an inheritable fashion. So what your parents are eating has a huge impact on your epigenome, and therefore the profile of health in your children. So we need to, and this is a slide that refers to some experience I've had in focus groups in dealing with consumers. We need to make sure that as it relates to the microbiome, we have better education about probiotics and their application. The vast majority of consumers believe that they don't need necessarily a probiotic, that they get all of their probiotics from food, particularly yogurt. And they're quite shocked when you explain to them, and if you actually read the label on a yogurt, that it says made with live bacteria. It doesn't guarantee live bacteria. And by the time you leave a supermarket, actually all the bacteria are dead. And over exuberant claims as it relates to a particular brand of yogurt here in the US named Activia is resulted in a huge fine by the FTC. It was over $20 million. So they've gone back and changed, but we need to have that conversation as it relates to consumers, that probiotics are not enough. First of all, it's one species, it's a transient species, and doesn't supply what you need. In any case, they're dead. Consumers are also massively confused about what a prebiotic is, absolutely clueless. So you need to do education around prebiotics and probiotics. The language I often like to use is probiotics are like seeds and the prebiotics are like fertilizer. If you want a good garden, you need to plant good plants and you need to fertilize them. And we also need, ultimately, in more sophisticated ways, to understand which bacteria are humanized. They like to live in humans. They set up shop, they proliferate, they grow, as opposed to transients and pathogens. And also the influence of diet as it relates to the nature of that microbiome. I mentioned the science of the epigenome. This is something that I'm particularly interested in. I've been working for some decades. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the epigenome is like the software of your genetic computer. You got the hardware from your mother and father, and you can't change it. At conception, you were given your hardware code. But the software can vary with time, with disease, and the software is this tags that sit on top of the DNA and regulate which genes are turned on or off, like a switch. And so some are turned on and some are turned off. For example, your liver cells do not want to be playing the software code for hair. I mean, who wants a hairy liver? Or vice versa, if you've got skin, you don't want your sweat glands to be suddenly saying, I'm a liver, I'm going to make bile, and you start to sweat bile. That's a disgusting thought. But there are certain cancers that lose control of their software. They're called teratomas, and they start creating all sorts of wild tumors because they start expressing all sorts of other genes that are inappropriate for that particular location. And the epigenome has a huge impact on health and disease. So as you get older and function perhaps wanes and you can't do things as well as you could when you're younger, it's not the fault of the hardware, it's not your genome, it's really a fault of your epigenome. And some of these things actually started also in the womb. So this is an example of a picture of agouti mice here. Agouti mice are a classic tool for studying obesity. The agouti mice classically is tan-colored and obese. And you can correct both the coloring of the fur and the obesity by treating the pregnant mother with dietary components that add these switches to your epigenome. So this is a classic epigenomic problem that you can correct through dietary interventions. Classic ones like B vitamins, genistein from soy, and things like that. Fully correct that pattern. So there are lots that you can do. And there's short-term regulators, which are called transcription factors, which are big proteins. They're a little bit easier to pull on or off, particularly as it relates to botanicals. And then there's smaller 1 to 2 carbon, either methyl or acetyl groups, that are either on the DNA or the histones that wrap around DNA that regulate gene expression. Those ones are inheritable, so they're passed on to the next generation. I want to give you some data just to emphasize the power of this. And this relates to a product that I made in a former company that I worked for, and it used these natural sources as regulators of gene expression. So I used boswellic acid, there's quercetin, curcumin, proanthocyanidins, ellagic acid, quinoa glycosides from the Amazonian plant cat's claw, catechins. All of these things went into a mix, and the idea was I was going to be able to modify gene expression. And we tested that in 2 human cell types in the context of inflammation. And this is the result of this. This is a test called a microchip gene array. In fact, we tested for variances in activity of every human gene, so 25,000 genes. And this, it seems a little difficult to read, but you've got 3 columns. You've got the control column. We hit the cells with interleukin-6 to mimic inflammation. And then we added interleukin-6 back with that cocktail of botanicals. And what you can see is that you see a different pattern. All you need to do is, if you don't know microchip gene array assays, is know the difference between red and green, turning on, turning off. And you can see that the middle panel shows a very different pattern during inflammation. And then that pattern totally changes in the context of those botanicals. And in fact, we were able to bring back into balance 7,500 genes with that particular range of botanicals. And the names of the genes are actually written on the side here. So this thing that looks like the photocopier had a dreadful diarrheal episode is actually the name of every gene that's being modified. So that's a tremendous tool. We shouldn't underestimate how fantastic a tool that is in managing health. When you take it in the context of a pharmaceutical where you're targeting one particular enzyme or a receptor. The pharmaceutical is very focused on specificity and potency, and nature is giving us the benefits of broader, more expansive results. Regulating 7,500 genes is a huge tool. So going into some of the intangibles, there is some things that we need to be aware of as the industry is moving along, and that is that the consumer is changing the way that they purchase products. And remember, they're often educated, so they're using the tools that are around them. So particularly the online aspects will change the way that we interact with the consumer and get our message across. The better we can do that, the better success we will enjoy, and a stronger impact we'll have on the health of the consumer. So we need to understand the influences of trust, price, what is involved in their decision making, the role of fear, how can we give them assurances and confidence. And not necessarily to be afraid of the blogosphere, but to actually engage with social media and make contributions. The other aspects is technology is helping us as well. We got all sorts of interesting delivery systems. This is an example of an innovation in capsules from Capsugel, which has a capsule inside of a capsule, so you can deliver products to different elements in the GI tract. You can have ones that are released in the stomach and then ones that are released in the lower intestines if needed. The other example is a bead-type nature where you protect the contents from stomach acid and aspects like that for delivery specifically to the lower intestine. So technology will help. The other aspect that we need to do a better job as members of the nutraceutical industry is not to create confusion. We often like to sort of piggyback on pharmaceuticals. We create confusion. One of the biggest ones that annoys me is related to the nitric oxide field. I was involved in that very, very early on as it relates to whether we should be using arginine substrates, when they work, when they don't work, what's the role of other factors like reactive nitrogen species, oxidants, and related issues. I won't bore you with my view of that particular world, but the other aspect is that we also misuse the term inflammation now, and we tend to use it in broad terms without understanding its particular role, whether it's acute inflammation, chronic inflammation, what are the drivers, how it's regulated. We tend to do it so often that the consumer is confused, and therefore we're losing our message. And the same for free radicals and antioxidants. People use them interchangeably. Free radical is not necessarily an oxidant is not necessarily a free radical. Different locations, whether it's lipid, water, there's a whole range of things that we all throw in one batch and totally confuse the consumer. So we need to do a better job at managing that. There is also a change in the industry at the moment. There is a huge scramble for validation. This is a change that's occurred in the last 5-6 years. In the US, largely driven by the Federal Trade Commission demanding that products have ample support for their claims. So there's a huge change with primarily ingredient suppliers doing clinical trials on their ingredients to put it in perspective and giving you the tools and the words that allow you to engage in the conversation with the consumer. This will evolve, and eventually the end product manufacturer will be doing more studies on their particular products, albeit giving more information, better choices available to the end consumer. But related to that, many of these companies are confused as to what constitutes a good study. Remember that if they're a manufacturing component, an industry component, they may not have the skills as it relates to understanding what is a good study as it relates to mechanism of action, what's a good design, what's the limitations of interpretations as it relates to a pilot study, open label, appropriately placebo controls. All of those aspects are not currently in the skill set of a lot of the ingredient manufacturers, and so they're scrambling to get the right information. So as it relates to just wrapping up in terms of a conclusion, there are another number of things to consider in terms of how the nutraceutical industry can be impactful on societal health and reducing healthcare expenditures. We have an important role, and the message is not easily getting out there. We are subject to significant threats, both external and internal. Internal meaning that the members of the community themselves bring on these particular problems through their behavior, and we need to make sure that those players are out of our particular industry. But navigating a lot of the issues that we have, I think what we need to do is emphasize transparency, validation, the educational aspects that we need to provide to the consumers to understand what is the intent and what is the nature of our products. And if you ultimately always have a very strong focus on what does the consumer need, that voice, that perspective will give you the tools to make the right choices as you lead up to it. So I thank you for your attention and appreciate the opportunity, and I'm certainly open to any questions that may have come out of the presentation. Thank you. I didn't get any violet waves at the back, so I presume I'm finished.
No, we're fine. If anyone has questions, I have a mic.
Yep.
How's it going? Thanks for that presentation. I had a question going back to kind of your threats in the industry. You talked about product adulteration. How much of it do you see in kind of false advertising? I know you didn't speak too much to the advertising and marketing portion.
That is not classically adulteration. Because I saw the audience is very international here, I didn't try and get in. I think I probably went more than enough in terms of the U.S. rules and regulations. Inappropriate marketing claims, whether they're unjustified, tend to be regulated by what's called the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S. That's the FTC. Their mantra is truth in advertising. So if you make a claim that you cannot support, for example, pick a botanical and you put in 100 milligrams and the data to support its application in a particular area requires 500 milligrams, but you used only 100 and you still make the claims, you will get fined or at least get a nasty letter. So that's a degree where the industry tries to capture the imagination of the consumer by what we often call label paint. There's ingredients in there that are in there at too lower amounts to really have any benefit, and then you make claims from them. If you make a claim, you'll get caught and you'll be fined or modified. But then there is the other aspect that is very pervasive of not necessarily having a claim, but just using it as label paint and making some sort of vague story that the consumer responds to, or consumers react to it. But because the consumer doesn't know that you need 800 milligrams or 100 milligrams and 25 means nothing. So that's ongoing, and I think what ultimately that will be limited, because obviously they're not working as intended. That'll be limited when the society changes into more of a social media setting where consumers will say, this worked for me. And if your approach is to minimize the dose or the amounts such that it never works, then you'll just get beaten out in the battle for consumer opinion. So that it's not classic adulteration. It's sort of like vague misinformation, which can be as sinister as adulteration. Interesting question. As for those of you who are not in the US, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, is a much more fearsome, powerful beast for the industry than necessarily the FDA. The FDA tends to send you nasty notes and can shut down your manufacturing if your manufacturing is not up to standards. But the Federal Trade Commission, in terms of truth in advertising, can give substantial fines. And I alluded, although it wasn't dietary supplements, to the Activia fine that was $20 million. They're big fines. So that's the one that's a little bit more fearful. And companies that are prone to hyperbole and exaggerating things tend to suffer. Any other questions? Yeah. Just a couple. Doesn't matter. Your choice. You got the microphone.
You were first. I came in a little late, but whatever I saw, I was quite interested in when you talked about biotin. Now in Biotune, you talked about gene regulation or regulation of its, how it functions, certain areas. So how do we know, what kind of safety studies are being done in such a case scenario where we are trying to modulate certain expression of genes and not, as you were talking about the software, not the hardware part. So is it going to, if you know, while giving the positive result that we are looking forward to, are we also looking at certain negatives which we may or may not know about?
That's a, you know, I think I understand the question, and let me rephrase it to make sure we're on the same. That is that clearly nature can influence gene expression, or the software or the switches that regulate whether genes are turned on or off. And if nature can do that, how are we assured that when we create a product that we don't have some sort of inadvertent, inappropriate modification of whether genes are turned on or off, that leading to compromised health? Yeah. Quite frankly, the industry is, and I don't think it would be also true for pharmaceuticals, even though it's less likely there, that we measure it. So I don't think that we really have any assurance that it's doing, that we have the sort of numbers to say that it's not going to happen. So could it happen? Absolutely. But what you'll see when you do controls related to that is in the context of changing gene expression, it doesn't alter unless there is some other provoking event. So if you did a control without interleukin-6 in that particular setting, nothing happens. So what it's doing is it's providing balance to an outside provocation. And that's often what you'll experience, and you'll pick it up in other outcomes. So in that particular case, there was 7,500 genes. You can measure the products of those particular genes in the usual way that we go about doing safety studies. So not only do you look at sort of systemic activity, organ function, you know, vital signs, some pathology and tissue samples, aspects like that. You can measure the end products of those particular genes. And usually what's happening in terms of natural products, under baseline settings, you just don't get any change, but they modify or balance outside provocations. So I wouldn't be as fearful. It's really not the way that nature works. There's a question at the back.
Thank you for the beautiful presentation. Please, I want to ask, you said that the U.S. government do not allow the clinical trials to be performed within U.S. Is it that they are using other countries as guinea pigs? I don't.
I see where you go. No, it's not like that they're not allowing clinical trials. There's tons of clinical trials that are done here. It's more expensive. First of all, it's normally more expensive. But secondly, as it relates to a natural product, there's more paperwork, perceived need for paperwork at this moment. And that is for, the reason being is the FDA has not established concrete rules as it relates to new dietary ingredients. So it's really in reference to that particular thing. What they've issued is a guidance. And the way the government works is that they issue this guidance and they see what kind of reactions people get and the impact on industry. And if there is no sort of major negative reaction, then eventually after a few years, guidance becomes policy. And so we're in this stage where we're functioning under this guidance, and various groups are nervous, and so they're looking to go elsewhere just because they're not sure what they're supposed to do. So it's not like it's some sinister, let's do devious experiments on the rest of the world and feed them curcumin and see if their hair falls out or they grow a third ear. Something horrible. It's really managing the paperwork as it's currently setting that is in a phase that lacks clarity. So just as a result, with an impending need of getting data, they'll go to some other country. Often it's Canada. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I wonder if in USA there's any, sorry, just now you mentioned the education. So any professional education you ask for your nutraceutical medicine?
In what aspects? Can you, in terms of education, is
Yeah,
the
education.
nutrition?
Nutraceutical medicine or nutrition?
For who would be the audience? Professionals or
Professionals.
consumers?
For nutritionists, but not just general nutritionists. They actually focus on nutraceutical
Yeah.
medicine or nutraceutical nutrition.
Yeah.
Any professional education in US?
You know, it varies. And there's no one overarching group. Certainly, we tend to rely in the US on what's called dietitians, but that information is very much dietetics, not necessarily supplements. In the medical schools, for training physicians, there's very little in the way of nutrition, and virtually nothing as it relates to nutraceuticals, botanicals, aspects like that. Sorry, I'm getting all my vague pictures here. That'll entertain you if I'm boring you verbally. I catch good fish sometimes. So again, and part of that is the educational program as it relates to medical schools is utterly inadequate. I did 30 years as a medical school professor. When I was ever brought out to discuss botanicals or nutraceuticals, they were expecting me to be very negative. And so they were often shocked that I would be describing positive elements, and so they ended up asking me. But it's a flaw. It depends on the audience. So I think it's a little stronger in the chiropractic training aspects, which is a little odd. Chiropractors are normally trained as it relates to bone alignments and things like that, but they have a very large component now of training in botanicals and nutrition. So it's fragmented, lots of different places, no one central group, and that may be part of the reason why we're very clumsy in interacting with both consumers and the media. So when the media goes, they have a question and they want to find some answers. Who do they go to get the appropriate answers? And they go to often people who have got either very little in the way of experience, knowledge, or training in that particular area. Now, they may have a fancy title, a professor or what have you, but in reality, they don't have the training and experience. It's a huge problem, I think, for us. Yeah.
Very interesting topic. I was just wondering.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering. I think they would always be skeptical, the public and the medical field, because I take my own students, my medicine students, and when they ask me, they hear something on the news that this product is very positive. Most of the time, I work with pectins and I believe they have certain benefits, but most of the time I would be skeptical too, because they start listing that they would solve everything. They would solve your intestinal problems, stop hair being falling off, and so on. So, and another thing is that you hear so many products. What is good? What is bad? You really don't know. So I don't know how that could be really traced, in the sense that I don't see really studies that kind of combine so many different functional food or nutraceuticals together, and then you see if that is beneficial or not. Like the Frost and Sullivan report, they tell you if you take magnesium and if you take, but if you combine all these together and you take other supplements, we don't really know what that would do. The concentrations might not be similar to what you eat normally.
True, and the Frost and Sullivan report was very structured as it relates to looking at economic benefits related to hospitals and the consumption of nutraceuticals. It wasn't related necessarily to diet. It's the big numbers, the demographic type numbers, but at least it helps provide some perspective. The aspect, there's a lot of fragmentation in the industry, and I think that's what you're commenting on and what you're picking up on, is that there are people who have been, over the years, overly involved in hyperbole as it relates to these outrageous claims. More and more they're getting eliminated from the platforms, but it still occurs. People get very enthusiastic and think it does everything. My own company does it as well, and so, you know, trying to control that is very, very difficult. As it relates to things related to diet and health, each consumer also believes in their own expertise based on their own experience. So they've gone through their lifetime as it relates to what I've eaten and how I've felt as a result of that. And so they have their own experience, which puts everything in perspective for them. So, and the other aspect is that in the context of trying to understand prevention medicine, that doesn't get a consumer's attention quite as well. So if you're taking a product that will reduce your risk of a disease 10 years from now, it's not very sexy. It's harder to sell that, so you end up making up some other commentary and running byline. So it's very difficult for all of us as individuals to show that sort of level of commitment to health. We're much more prone to be motivated to say, oh my goodness, something's not working anymore, and you know, my joints are aching and I need to do something big, and you get their attention at that end stage. So even though I think nutraceuticals, natural products have this tremendous potential for health maintenance, the way that society and individuals work is we're always still trying to plug it in on problem solving. So you're going to have a discord. Yeah, difficult. Human nature. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Coffee break time, is it?
Yeah.